today. We're going to continue our study of John, and this week we are going to be in John 13. Will you pray with me as we get started? God, thank you so much for today. We thank you for your word, and we thank you just for the time to open your word and to just abide with you. I pray that as we do so, God, that you will speak to us and you will teach us something and just illuminate your word for us, God. We love you and we pray all of this in Jesus' holy and precious name. Amen. So John 13 today. We are definitely over halfway now in the book of John, but we are well into this last week of Jesus's life. So we've spent the last 2 weeks in John 12 reading about Jesus being anointed at Bethany by Mary, coming into Jerusalem on the donkey. And then last week we talked about Jesus's predictions of his death and learning that the hour has come. And we have John's commentary on the belief and unbelief of the people and a final plea from Jesus for belief. And at this point in John's gospel, we have a turn. And the turn is, we talked about at the very beginning in our intro to John, we talked about how John can be divided into two parts, the book of signs and the book of glory. And the book of signs is where we've been. It deals a lot with Jesus' public ministry. So out and about among the people, performing signs and teaching publicly. And then now in chapter 13, we have a turn to the book of glory. And the focus in the book of glory is the glorification of Jesus, which happens at the cross. And so everything is driving to that point. And the other part of the book of glory is we have Jesus teaching in a private setting, just to his disciples, or we could say just to those who have truly believed. So we had just previous to this, we had this plea from Jesus about believing in him, and we had John's commentary on why some were struggling to believe and why others were choosing to believe. And so the disciples, well, minus Judas, but the disciples represent those who truly believe. And the teachings that we're going to read of Jesus in the next several chapters, really from 13 all the way through chapter 17, are all to his disciples, that inner circle of people who were his closest followers, and he was wanting to give them this message before he leaves. We really get a sense in this section of John of Jesus preparing his disciples for what they're about to face. And we're going to get a little taste of that today as we work our way through chapter 13 and even into a little bit of 14. There'll be a little overlap between this week's video and next because our curriculum goes into the very beginning of chapter 14. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit this week, and then I'll circle back and talk about the beginning of chapter 14 a little bit next week, as I think that it ties in both weeks. So just a word of that to be watching for that. But let's go ahead and start here. So John 13 opens by setting the scene a little bit. We already know it's the Passover time, right? Jesus rode into Jerusalem and the crowd had been gathering for the Passover. And so we know that's the time, that's the time of the year. And we find out in verse 1 that Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. So we find out that the time has come. We first heard it back in chapter 12. Previous to that, in this gospel, we've heard his time hadn't come yet. It's not time. The time has not come, but now the time, in fact, has come. And so John tells us here in this first verse that the time has come and Jesus knew that it's time for him to leave this world and go to the Father. And it says, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And then the very next thing in this section is Jesus washing his disciples' feet. Now, foot washing in the ancient world was a ritual, a daily ritual for cleansing, and it was a very common thing to be done. I mean, think about people wearing sandals and walking everywhere. Your feet are going to get very dirty just in a normal day, not even on going on an extra long hike. But I was just thinking about, I like to hike in sandals, and it is very common I have had some hiking sandals, and my feet at the end of a day on a dusty hill country trail, well, they definitely are pretty dirty. So in the ancient world, this ritual of daily cleansing was very common. And it also could have been done, would have been done as have some religious activity as well as just a token of hospitality. So proper etiquette, though, would have said that when guests arrive at your house, they should have their feet washed. And this would have been done by a servant. And there's some documentation in some Jewish literature that this was thought to be such a lowly task that Jewish servants would not have done this. It was a task reserved for Gentile servants. And so these Jewish servants were exempt from doing such a menial task. And for the most part, that's how foot washing was viewed, as this menial task. And it was considered to be pretty lowly. Though there are some instances where it is seen as an act of devotion or humility as well. But the common view on foot washing would have been something that was unfit for a Jewish servant or slave and would have been relegated to that of the Gentile servant or slave. But yet we see Jesus here at this dinner. The evening meal was in progress, and we can put this in the time period of the Last Supper if we want to match up with what is going on in the other Gospels. And Jesus got up from the meal in verse 4, and it says, took off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel around his waist. And after that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. So Jesus is doing something rather surprising. Definitely would not have been teacher washing students' feet. It would have been the other way around, perhaps as an act of devotion. So Jesus is flipping the tables on what is socially acceptable, and he is taking the position of a slave, of a servant, doing this task that was relegated to the lowest servant in a household. And so he comes to Peter, and Peter says, no. Are you going to wash my feet? And Jesus says, you do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand. And Peter just pushes back, you should never wash my feet. And then Jesus says, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. And then Peter goes to the opposite extreme and says, well, then don't just wash my feet, but wash my hands and my head also. And so like Peter, though, right? To go from one extreme to the other, he seems to be portrayed like that often in the Gospels. And so, but I totally get his pushback. I mean, would you let Jesus wash your feet? Would you have responded like Peter, like, no, I need to wash your feet. You can't wash mine. I would imagine that I would respond more along the lines of Peter, like, no. That I should be washing your feet. You're Jesus. You're the one I'm following and I respect. And I've been watching you perform all of these miracles. And I think that you're the Messiah and you've come from God. I'm not going to let you wash my feet, my dirty, dusty feet that are just caked in a layer of dirt. That you could see the outline of my sandals when I took my shoes off. You can't touch my feet. I can just hear that. I mean, it would go through my mind. I would be very reluctant to have Jesus wash my feet, I think. But Peter's response is showing us how shocking what Jesus was doing was to the disciples. He's turning over the proper social order. And we don't really have foot washing in our society as something we do. We have closed-toed shoes, so it's not something that's a necessity in the same way. But here we have Jesus turning the tables on what is expected as a way, almost as saying, things in the kingdom that in Jesus's kingdom are going to be a little bit different. Jesus is a different kind of king. So let's go on and look at how Jesus responds to Peter. Jesus answers, those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him. Then he goes on and he finishes and puts his robe back on. And he says, do you understand what I have done for you? Verse 13. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should also wash one another's feet. I have set you as an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. So Jesus is saying that he is turning the tables. He is a different kind of king, and his kingdom is going to look different. So Jesus washing his disciples' feet is just a picture of the self-giving love that we're going to continue to see poured out for us in the gospel. And it's an example for how his disciples are to interact with one another. This theme of love. And love is going to continue to pop up here as we continue to read these last things that Jesus wants to communicate to his disciples. We'll see it later in chapter 13. We're going to see it next week and following week. Love is very important and something that Jesus is communicating. Another thing that strikes me about this passage is that Jesus fully knew what Judas was about to do. Yet he washed Judas's feet anyways. And that's always been something that just strikes me. I mean, Jesus talks about loving our enemies, and we've talked about that in church a few Sundays ago, and it's in the Sermon on the Mount. And you just think about Jesus looking into Judas's eyes and washing his feet, knowing full well what was about to happen. That is the kind of love that Jesus expects of his followers, of his disciples. And then picking up in verse 18 and following, we see Jesus predicting Judas's betrayal. And Jesus says that he wants them to know, he who shared my bread has turned against me. And he says, I'm telling you this now. So this is verse 19. Before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am who I am. And then he goes on and says it even more plainly. It says Jesus was troubled in spirit, and then he shares with them, very truly, I tell you, one of you is going to betray me. And if you were one of the disciples sitting there, how would you have received this coming from Jesus? I mean, he's very obviously troubled. I mean, John says he's troubled in spirit, but I can imagine that it was coming out in his body language and just the way his voice sounded, that he was just troubled to his very depths of his being, and that he knew what was going to happen. And can you imagine hearing that and hearing those words and looking around at your brothers around you that you've been traveling with for 3 years, who you've been following Jesus with? You've been through some stuff. You've seen some awesome things. You had some amazing experiences. And yet one of these guys is going to betray Jesus? I can imagine the turmoil they were all experiencing. And then we see that they're looking around, trying to figure out who. And it says one of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. And Simon Peter motioned to this disciple, and said, ask which one he means. So a couple of things I wanted to point out about this verse here with the beloved disciple, and then we'll get back to Judas, is the first one, the beloved disciple. We're told that that's the one who wrote John's gospel. So we think this is John, and he is the one who he's sitting near Jesus. And so they want him to ask this question. And one of the commentaries I read this week said that perhaps this title of beloved disciple was bestowed on John by his followers, those who he was teaching. And it was something that they gave him the title of, maybe. And I thought that was kind of interesting. And so it wasn't necessarily, perhaps it wasn't his own self-identification, which always has struck me as interesting. Yeah, I'm the beloved disciple. That sounds funny. But anyways, I digress. So that's just an interesting little tidbit. But this other idea about reclining at the table. So the way that the table would have been a U-shaped table. This would have been a table where they could sit around the perimeter of it, and we left the opening in the middle for the servers to come in and put the food on the table easily. So it wouldn't have been this big long line. It'd be more like a U shape. And this was a Roman triclinium table. That's what it's called. And so the Jews had kind of adopted this. I mean, this was the common type of table they would have sat on. And then they would have reclined. So it was a low table to the floor. And they would have reclined and supported their body on their left arm and used their right arm for eating, with their feet extended away from the table. Now, this sounds like a very unique posture. I can't really imagine eating in that way, but that is very common. So when they say he's reclining next to him, that is what John is meaning here. So the beloved disciple asks Jesus, "Who is it?" And Jesus gives the answer, "It is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I dipped it in the dish." And then he gives this piece of bread to Judas. And it says in verse 27, "As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him." And Jesus says, "What you are about to do, do quickly." But nobody understood what was going on. They kind of missed that a little bit, I think. Maybe thought that Judas was going to go out, and we were even told that Judas was in charge of the money. Maybe he was going out to get something for the festival or something else that they needed. But Judas leaves and he goes out, and it was night. Isn't that an interesting designation here? We've been talking a lot about light and dark in John's gospel, and they've been eating, and we are told that Judas is filled with Satan, and we are told that Satan enters Judas and he goes out, and it is night. The darkness is trying to overcome the light. So after Judas leaves, Jesus really starts to prepare his disciples for what is going to happen next. And so it sets, Judas leaving is setting into motion the events that are going to send Jesus to the cross. And so Jesus is wanting his people, his disciples, to be prepared. And that's what Jesus says in verse 31. "Now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will glorify the Son in himself and will glorify him at once. My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now. Where I am going, you cannot come." So this long expected moment is here, where the Son of Man is going to be glorified. It's the hour is upon them. And then Jesus is going to continue on, and he says in verse 34, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." So this new commandment is to love one another, and that is going to be a mark of a community who follows Jesus. So when we think about Christ's love being our model and our identifying feature, well, how has he lived out and shown his love? Well, his love means he's going to wash our feet, our dirty, nasty feet. He's going to wash those and do it even though it's something that's considered to be a lowly job, a lowly thing to do, a humble thing to do. And he's going to do that. He is the kind of love that Jesus is modeling, is this self-sacrificing, self-giving love that seeks to serve, and it seeks not its own interests, but the best interests of others. And this self-giving love of Jesus is what's going to be poured out on the cross. That is the love that is to be the model and the identifying feature for a community who follows Jesus. Everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Not just like, "Oh yeah, I love you, you're pretty cool," but self-giving, seeking the betterment of others over and against your own self. That is the type of love that is going to be attractive to the world, because it is a different type of love than the type of love we see the world saying is love. And then Peter again, he's going to come again, and he's going to ask a question. And he asks a very natural question, because Jesus has just said, "I'm going to be going away, and I'm only going to be with you for a little bit longer." So Peter asks the natural question, "Well, where are you going?" And Jesus doesn't directly answer. Instead, he says, "Well, you can't follow me now, but you can follow me later." And that's really not a direct answer to Peter's question, because he wants to know where Jesus is going. And Thomas is going to pick up on that in just a little bit later in verse 5 in chapter 14. But first, Jesus is going to say to Peter, well, because Peter wants us to follow Jesus now, and Jesus says, but you're going to deny 3 times that you even know me before the rooster crows. Can you imagine how the disciples are feeling at this point? Jesus has washed their feet. He's predicted that someone is going to betray him. That person is revealed to be Judas, and Judas leaves, even though they're still confused about it. That's all just weird. And then the next thing they find out is Jesus is leaving. And then he turns around and doesn't really tell them where he's going, but tells Peter, you can't follow him. By the way, you're going to deny me. No wonder the first verse of chapter 14 is, don't let your hearts be troubled. Of course they were troubled. This whole situation is very troubling, and it seems to be getting more so by the minute. I mean, Jesus himself sounded troubled in spirit. And so he reiterates, don't be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. And then he talks about his Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, I would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you may also be where I am. You know the way to the place where I'm going. So once again, he's not telling them where he's going. He's saying, but you know the way, and you'll be able to follow it. And so Thomas then asks the next natural question is, but if we don't know where we're going, how can we know the way? Right? So they're just going through these very natural progressions of what they want to know. So Jesus' answer as to where are you going is, well, you know the way. If you were to ask someone where they're going and they were to answer you that way, you'd be like, this doesn't make any sense. I want a direct answer. But how true is that? We don't know what the destination is going to look like, but we do know the way, because Jesus is the way. He says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. The destination is far beyond their ability to understand or comprehend. Jesus is going to prepare that place, but he is the way through death to life. Jesus is the way. So we do know the way, even if we don't know all the things about the destination. Jesus is the way. And this discourse is going to continue on, and we're going to talk about the rest of it next week in our study of the rest of chapter 14. But I think this conversation in 14:6 of I am the way and the truth and the life is just so revolutionary. Can you imagine being the disciples and sitting there and just being so troubled and so confused, and they're looking at Jesus and saying, I'm the way. I am the way. I am the truth, and I am the life. Leslie Newbegin, one of the commentators I read, put it this way. He says, through Jesus, we are not given a sketch of what lies on the other side of the curtain of death, but a firmly marked way through that curtain. Jesus is the way. He is the only way through. And that is what he is telling his disciples here. I am the only way. Preparing you for what's about to happen. Don't be troubled about it. You need to rest and rely on what I have taught you. That I am going away, but I am coming back. I am the way. So we are going to continue on next week in chapter 14. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of these things that Jesus is teaching his disciples in these final hours before he is betrayed. So I hope you'll join me back next week, and we will keep going. Bye!